Oh, no more credit card numbers over the phone, or everybody's gonna have a field day. All right, so we got some heavy hitters with RBA also here today. So Jim and Stuart are kind of the pioneers that this has kind of evolved over the years from. So really good to see them here as well. So hopefully anything that I'm not able to answer, they can jump in and answer. All right, let's see if slide deck wants to work today. There we go. So who am I? I'm Tony. I've been with bitsIO now for a little over 2 years. I've been Splunk Professional Services for over 5 years at this point. I'm the guy that solves a lot of the issues, does a lot of the migrations, and now I've been doing a lot of RBA. So not going to go through all of this today, but really we're going to start with defining what RBA set out to solve. Give you kind of a high level overview of what RBA is, what a risk rule is, how we handle risk a little bit differently than ES. We'll jump into a quick demo and then quickly talk about what's new with 6.4. So that's going to be some exciting stuff there. So what is the problem? SOCs have alert fatigue. You know, we have all of these different signals coming in from all the different products. We're creating very, very granular detections. So most of the time we're looking at maybe 1 or 2 different source types at a time, whether it's Palo Alto or, you know, CrowdStrike or something like that. And then we're creating basically a one-to-one alerting or summarizing the data and creating alerting for analysts to look at. When they start looking at the data, they'll start seeing the same thing pop up multiple times, and then we get into this whitelisting as a kind of a reaction to all the noise that they're seeing, because, you know, 1,000 tickets a day, analysts aren't going to be able to solve that. So you start whitelisting yourself out of the problem, which also hides all those systems. If something really does go bad on them, you've whitelisted it and you're not going to see it. And then we get the awesome user problem where adding more data sources, adding more detections means more alerts, which means more SOC analysts, which means more money. So to scale, normally you need to add more people. So changing the perspective a little bit, we want to look at the process and change the process. So we want to use tools that are out there, and we want to make this so we can scale, retain happy analysts, and not keep throwing people at the problem. So how do we do this? We basically add a layer of abstraction. So instead of going one-to-one from a raw data, summarizing it and sending it into a notable event, we kind of add this abstraction layer, which is risk. So what does that look like? So yeah, okay, so typically your analytics goes directly into your alerting, you get tons of alerting, and most analysts can't handle all of it. So what do? You start ignoring stuff, or again, whitelisting it. So what we're trying to do, or what we've done, is taking that analysis, putting those into the risk index instead of the notable index, and we call those a risk rule. So think of your typical correlation rules, and even more broadly, you know, anything that could add value or context to a situation, and we put all of that in this abstraction layer. So, you know, you're no longer trying to finely tune some of these risk rules. You just kind of throw all the data in there and then sift through the data. So with this abstraction layer, we can start putting lenses on this and start looking at stuff based on risk score, looking at it based on MITRE ATT&CK or whatever your favorite framework is. We can map all of these notable event, or what used to be correlation searches. We can map those to whatever framework that you like, and start looking at things that have crossed multiple attacks or tactics. We can start looking at stuff based on business units, or however else you want to divide up your company, to start looking at, you know, stuff, you know, is finance doing something, or do they have a use case that we want to identify for finance or our executives? So we can look at it that way as well. And basically all of these lenses is what leads to the notable event, so the alert that your analysts are going to look at. So how do we do this? We utilize enterprise security. We utilize basically everything in enterprise security. So ES assets, identities. We modify what goes into the risk framework. So in a minute, I'll show you what that new risk data model looks like. But we modify what goes into the risk framework and how we get data in there as of, well, pre 6.4. Those are, and then basically what comes out of the risk framework, your risk indicator rules or risk notables, ends up going into your notable events. So what's this look like? So we have our risk rules that could be your anomalous login, malware detected, new scheduled task created, all of those things that, typically analysts wouldn't have looked at because, if you schedule tasks a lot, you don't really want to waste their time, so you ignore it. But now that adds context. So we want to capture all of these seemingly noisy things in that risk index. So as we sift through there and look at it with a different lens, we can start to paint a picture and tell a story. How do we do that? Well, the correlation search that actually goes into the notable index, typically you're gonna have very few of them. I'd say most customers are at 3. I've seen a couple customers a little bit higher than that, but you're gonna look at it in multiple ways. Those are basically your lenses. So crossing a certain threshold over 24 hours, crossing multiple tactics and techniques. And the cool thing is you can start to look over large sets of time. So you can look over 7 days or a month to find some of those low and slow attacks going on, where looking at a 30 days worth of your networking data with a data model, that's not gonna be very fast. So we can start to solve some other things. So what are the benefits? We're going to reduce the alerting, improve detections, improve your maturity, scale without adding analysts, increased analytics, and it's relatively easy to deploy, and it's going to get even easier. Well, it has gotten even easier as you upgrade Splunk. So diving back into risk rules, I'm going to fly through this real quick, and then we're going to actually go look at it in the demo. So content management, we're all familiar with that. We have risk rules, and again, risk rules are normally, in this case, mapping to MITRE. So RBA, which is kind of a template to use and get you started, that has a lot of this content already built. That's all mapped to MITRE. So that was the framework that was chosen for that. So a lot of these are looking for detections from MITRE.
Tony, quick question.
Yeah.
With the installs that you've done in the wild, are they mostly MITRE ATT&CK, and were there other ones? Are people still doing kill chain?
Everything I've done has been MITRE. So I think that's really what I've seen kind of across the board is everybody's mapping to that at this point.
Yep, same thing I see globally.
Yeah. I actually haven't seen anybody mapped to anything else. I know the new framework has some of those, kill chain and NIST, but I haven't seen anybody map there yet. And also feel free to jump in, everybody, as you have questions. But like I said, I'm trying to go kind of quickly through the boring stuff. We'll show you where the slide deck is so you can dig into it and see it in detail. But I want to show you the cool stuff. So what is a risk rule? So this is an example of a risk rule. So we have our typical, what would be our notable event, or what used to be a notable or correlation search that generated a notable event. We're going to do a few things to it. One of the hardest things, and we'll get into this as well, is how do we identify the same system the same way every time? Or the same user the same way every time? So there's multiple ways to map IPs to host names from your firewall logs. Sometimes you have fully qualified domain names and you just want the empty host name. So one of the biggest challenges out of the gate is how do we normalize and how do we want to normalize our data?
Well, hold on. It seems to me that one of the benefits of this is you don't have to normalize. You can say this guy can be known by 10 things, so I'm going to add risk score to all 10 of those things. And then whatever lens you apply, if it's by IP or whatever, you wouldn't necessarily have to correlate everything, right? Ideally, you would,
Yeah,
but in this approach, you don't necessarily have to, and you can still have a lot of value. Where in some cases, if you can't correlate an IP, everybody to an IP, you have no value whatsoever.
correct. Yeah. So how I've typically seen customers do this, first they'll use their assets and identities, but again, that's normally your static stuff. Then they'll look at DHCP. So a lot of these customers will have some sort of custom DHCP lookup that's updating in real time or near real time, so that we can do quick lookups and say, all right, who has this IP at this particular time? What system is that? Because DHCP tomorrow it's going to be some new system has it, and that doesn't really help us. So normally we try to normalize at the point that we put it into the risk index, because that's going to give us the most value, and we're going to be able to know what that system is. Now, as you said, not everything's going to be able to get normalized. So basically you make your best attempt to normalize it, and if you can't, then you can just put it in with the IP, or especially external IPs, and most of the time you're not going to be able to normalize those. And my last customer was doing a lot with external IP addresses. But as far as names, again, using assets and identities, you might have T Suite, you might have T Suite at bitsIOinc.com. So depending on what service I'm logging into, it makes it really hard. It's one of the challenges with ES, to say, well, what has Tony done? So normalizing it at the time of the risk rule gives us that ability to say, this is, even though it's a cloud service and I logged in with an email address, that's really Tony. And a lot of that is kind of encompassed in macros. So while it's called out kind of here, most of the time you're going to standardize how you do that, and it's going to be a macro that you call, and you're going to do it the same way every time. So it's not additional work per se, once you figure out how you want to do that.
This is Jim, and I'll just add one more thing. This is pretty forward thinking because hardly anybody's actually looked at ES 6.4 in production yet. But one of the really interesting things that has happened is there's been a lot of tie-ins back into that asset identity all through the product, and it's all specific to RBA. So lots of big backend changes. So little things like identity is somewhat easy this day or these days, in the sense. Can anybody hear me, or is it just me?
Morning.
No,
No, you're good.
Yeah,
Okay.
fantastic. Okay. So I moved the AL6 alert into pre.
muted. There you go. Continue.
Okay. Yep. So on the identity side of the house, we will always now do lookup. So if you persist, Jim at whatever versus JApker versus Jim Apker at like whatever, all those identity things are interesting as long as they're in that identity column within the identity framework. That's interesting because all of that stuff is now carried all through the product. So we do automatic lookups now on source user, desk user, user, risk object, like all of that stuff, which is really cool. So we don't have that like hardcore need to make sure that we normalize perfectly going into the risk analysis data model for identity. But for host, and we've been saying this for 3 years, I mean, the hosting is the hardest one, right? You have to get that absolutely right. And it usually goes back to a host name. But yeah, there's a lot of underpinnings that have been improved in ES 6.4. That's it.
Awesome. Thank you. From there, you can map to whatever framework you want. So in this case, we were manually calling out, your tactic and your technique and some external documentation. We've also, new ES has a pre-built MITRE lookup. So we reach out to a MITRE endpoint and pull in all of the MITRE framework and basically create a lookup for you that has all of this context. So this makes it really easy. Going forward, if you're pre 6.4, you can just say it's, T1089, reference that lookup and get all of this additional context. So there's less typing, less manual work. in ES6.4, it actually gives you a place to map your framework and your tactic and technique right in the correlation rule. So that's a step further where you don't even have to do this in your risk search. You would actually do this within the GUI of your correlation rule. Risk message, this is really the message that we want to provide high value, and it's going to be what the analysts see. So in this case, a command was found disabling a security control. I wouldn't say that that's that descriptive. I might put in what the command was. Now, sometimes commands are really long and we can't show the whole thing. So maybe a subset of the command. But depending on what it is, we can concatenate strings together to make the risk message. So in a minute, you'll see what a story looks like, and that's really what we're looking at is all those risk messages. We assign some sort of impact and confidence. Sometimes people find this tricky. So impact is, how impactful it's going to be. Confidence is kind of a tuning knob as far as, how confident are we that this is a true attack? And that helps create a risk score. Now, what I've seen a lot of clients do is kind of deviate from this approach a little bit, and they'll just create a base risk score that we then kind of ramp up or ramp down depending on what we want. I think ES6.4, Jim, correct me if I'm wrong, it is a base risk score.
Yep. So base to start with, and then you've got that whole risk factoring framework behind the scenes. That's an independent framework, and it's kind of a global rule editor that allows you to kind of create context around users and assets, and then that's applied as data is moved from index into data models. It's a really clever place to put that. But yep, base score to start with.
And then the last thing we do is call either a system or a user risk score macro. In this case, we're passing in our impact confidence, our source system, our source category, and our source priority. Or for the user, we're just passing in the source user. And basically, we'll take a look at what those do in a little bit, but that's going to take those ratchet up or down the score based on whatever parameters you tell it, and then save it to the risk index. Let's see. So another example, this one, we have a better risk message. So you can see that we're concatenating stuff in here. So what's the current directory? What's the parent process? So we can make this message and craft it to make it really usable for the analyst. There's that new dictionary or new lookup, MITRE dict. This one is in RBA. I think it's called something different in ES6.4, but they're both doing basically the identical thing. That's become part of the product. We have a test mode. So test mode is a mode that you can put in there if you'd like. As you're adding a new risk rule, you might not want it to generate a notable event, so you can put a test mode flag on there. Basically, in our risk notable rules, we'll just ignore those so that we can start to see what impact would that have on our notable events without overbearing the analyst if one of our risk rules is way too noisy or adds way too much risk. So it gives us kind of a testing period while you're still in production, because a lot of times you don't have the data you need in UAT to get a true test. Threat object is another new concept that hasn't made it into ES yet, but hopefully it will in the future. But threat object is really the, what's actually having risk associated with it. So what this is going to allow us to do is start to look at associated objects. So things that have the same command line, the same file hash. It's also going to help us with any SOAR integrations. So if you're using Phantom, we can actually pass in the file hash, and now Phantom can do a lot of additional lookups and checks, with third-party tools to see if that's a malicious file hash. Do all of that analysis and potentially close the ticket out as a false positive before an analyst even sees it. And then again, passing in to that risk macro. You're going to see the risk macro has changed multiple times, so you'll see that thing change a lot, but it is very customized per customer. And that's the great thing about this is it is very customizable. So it's digging into those macros. Oh, no, back into risk rules. So again, assigning the base risk score is impact. The tuning knob is your confidence. And then we have the modifier. So typically we're using the identity and asset framework. So either your category field or your priority field, your vulnerabilities data model to see if that system has known vulnerabilities on there. And you can start to add risk based on those. So we have our risk macros for user system. We have our risk data model. So the ones in blue are what are in the risk data model today. The ones in white are what we modify and add to that risk data model. So this is the risk data model out of the box of ES. We just add additional fields to it to make it so that we can then use T-stats and all of that to sift through that data. And then it writes it into the existing risk index that comes with enterprise security. It writes data using pipe collect. So the one caveat here is any out-of-the-box thresholding that you're used to does not work. There is in RBA, there is, I think it's in there now, a throttling framework that you can utilize to simulate that. The cool thing is in ES6.4, all of that goes away because we fixed or changed how the risk adaptive response action works. So we actually have native throttling without this method.
Hang on a second. I'm not following you on the throttling. So the whole point of this is you don't throttle, you don't whitelist. You let everything come in and build up. So where is throttling a concern? I thought that was one of the benefits of this is you just, you let it all slip through, you classify it appropriately, and then you watch for what builds up.
Yeah,
where
yeah.
is throttling?
Yeah, that's a good question. So my last implementation, one of the biggest concerns there is if we narrowly define these rules, so we're running this rule every 30 minutes, and we're only looking at 30 minutes worth of data, then if we have system maintenance in the middle of the night, we're gonna skip those and not look at a set of data. So they wanted to run the rules every 30 minutes, but run it over a longer period of time, say 2 hours. Which if you're looking for a specific thing, that could and did lead to a lot of duplicate events. So throttling helped us there where we could look at a wider range of data multiple times and still not inundate the risk index with the same thing from the same raw event, if that makes sense.
Yep, that's legit. I mean, I've seen that as well. Overlapping windows, late arriving data, all that kind of stuff. And then I thought you also had another one, Tony, that we talked about based on one of your customer experiences, and it was something like a specific document, or it wasn't necessarily behavioral in nature. It was some other use case where I asked the same question that Greg did for that instance, and the end result was like, oh yeah, I guess that does make sense. It's like I don't want to see the same user run the same Word doc 60 times, if whatever didn't happen. But do you remember what that was?
Yeah. So in that case, what was it? It was, I think it was Silence or one of those products, but it was basically picking up the same file or some process was running and it was picking up the same thing. So in your raw data, you had 10,000 hits on this one thing, and it was the same file every time. So what ended up happening is that risk rule was contributing about 10,000 points of risk to that endpoint every day. And after looking at it, the analyst was, didn't like that. They only wanted it per file to generate one notable or one risk event per day. So on those super noisy things that, your systems that are alerting, regularly, that keep alerting on the same thing, it just gives you another tuning knob to say, well, we want to see it, but if we've already seen it for that file, don't show it again for 24 hours or whatever that might be. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thanks.
Awesome. So digging into the macros, we'll go look at that after. So we have our, well, I should go back and say, so we can go to rbaallday.com. That's going to bring you over to the SA RBA repo. So this is all in GitHub. User community, there's a lot of things in here from a lot of people. So this is basically a starting point for you. If you go and grab this and add it to your search head, you'll have a lot of these out of the box risk score or macros for risk scores, for normalizing some of your data. And we can basically help streamline your implementation. So looking at one of those risk rules for this risk score user, what are we actually doing in that macro? So we passed in that username, the risk object, the impact, the confidence. And then from there, we can go and change impact and confidence into a number. So there's a lookup to do that. And then we can start looking at risk modifiers. So this is really the power of the framework, is we can say, all right, if we have a privileged user, let's start adding to our modifier count. If it's a contractor, executive, somebody on the whitelist. If it's a allowed connection, ratchet the score up, or if it's a block connection, ratchet the score down. Is what I saw in my last customer a lot is, you know, if you have some firewall event, but your firewall did the right thing and blocked it, we want to know about it for context, but we don't really care as much as if it was actually allowed through and it was something malicious. So this is basically a customizable framework for you to ratchet up, ratchet down your score based on whatever your needs are. So typically, again, it's based on the asset and identity framework, the user category, or priority fields. Also business unit, those sort of things. From there, we generate a risk score based on the impact and the confidence after we change those into numbers. And then we add up your risk modifiers and basically add 1 to it. So there's this base, what it's going to do is every risk modifier, we're going to ratchet up the score by 25%. So if your base, and this is where the impact confidence confuses people, but let's talk 6.3 or 6.4 and above, you give it a base risk score saying of 5. You might have, it might be a privileged executive assistant. So there's 2 risk modifiers. So we're going to ratchet that up by another 50%. So instead of 5, you're going to get a total risk score of 7.5. So that's where the risk modifiers are coming in. And then finally, we pipe collect into the risk index. Now, pipe collect, again, this is happening in the search. And that's why all of your native throttling that are in the correlation search builder do not work. Pre-6.5, pre-6.4. And rewrite to the summary index. So the cool thing is now we can go and start looking at this data using the risk analysis dashboard. It's a dashboard, I think, before I really did RBA. In my 4 years of doing ES, I saw 1 customer using. So hopefully we're going to get a lot more customers using this dashboard because all of a sudden it can actually start giving you good insight into your data. So we can start seeing our risky systems, risky users, and then all of those risk rules. So what's actually happening in my network, and you know, which ones are adding the most risk overall.
Hey, Tony, just a quick question. I know you've got some RBA installs and you've got one big giant one recently, but how did you or the customer go about tuning risk rules? Were they focused on this dashboard or were they custom dashboard?
Custom dashboard. So I think we have a screenshot of it coming up, but we basically used SARBA's tuning as our baseline, looking at how much risk was being added per risk rule, how many hits per risk rule there were per day, and looking at that. And then once we started looking at the notable events, you could start seeing things that basically was adding too much risk. So, you know, we're getting notable events for things that we didn't care to see it. So we would go in and figure out why and ratchet the score down. And that's a lot of those are the ones that, you know, normally when we didn't want to see it was when the system did what it was supposed to do and blocked it. So we were doing a lot with the action field. So if it was something that the system blocked, we would basically half the score to make it so that, you know, we had it as context, but we weren't creating notable events for things that were constantly being blocked.
Yep.
So we can start to use that risk data model and looking at the data that way. Risk rules, where do we start? MITRE is, again, I think you've heard Jim and I say this multiple times, but MITRE is really where everybody's been mapping to pretty consistently that we've seen. But for the content, Splunk Security Essentials is a great place. That's going to show you a lot of what enterprise security, ES content update, and security essentials all kind of wrapped in one. I think there's 480 searches in there last I checked. So that's a really good repository of, you know, ideas to begin with. A lot of it gives you starter SPL. Believe RBA also has 40 rules or so already built in there. And hopefully we'll start seeing more of those being created and shared around the community as well. So talking about risk indicators real quick, and then we'll jump into kind of a live demo. So risk indicator rule, we call them risk notables now. These are your standard correlation searches. So these are what you're used to today. You're gonna, you know, again, have 3, maybe 4 or 5, probably not more than 10 of these. So very light on correlation searches. So looking at something 7-day or over 7 days, looking at anything that has exceeded the threshold for MITRE attack. In this case, we're looking for where a risk object has shown 3 or more tactics from 4 or more sources. Sorry, source count. This is actually rules. So three or more tactics from 4 or more rules, risk rules. And again, these are pretty standardized. So I think for the most part, we took this exact search. I think we added a couple of macros to it to make it a little easier to read. And this is what I deployed at my last client. So the risk indicator rules, risk notables, these are pretty reusable client to client or, you know, customer to customer, and gives you a really good place to start with that first lens. There's another one for looking at a threshold over, I don't know if we have it in here. Yeah, threshold over for total risk score. So does any user or risk object have more than 100 points normally in a period of time, being a day? And if they do, then create a notable event based on that. Here, throttling does work. So this is where we can, again, run this more frequently. My last customer, we were running risk indicator rules every 30 minutes. And we had most risk notables or risk rules down to 30 minutes. So from the time raw event to the time that I hit a notable event at max was 1 hour for pretty much everything across the board. All right, so we have risk rules, risk incident rules.
When you throttle it there with the native throttling, so the throttling applies to all the adaptive response actions, right?
Throttling, yes, correct.
Yeah, and so like if you run this, this is a perfect example. You say if you run the search every 30 minutes, but it runs for the last 2 hours, you would throttle it for 2 hours and get a very sensible response, right?
Right, exactly, yeah. So typically, you know, we're gonna look at a 24-hour window for this guy. I think it's back here. Let's see if I can get to it quickly. Yeah, so normally there's a 24-hour risk score threshold. So we're looking at risk objects that have more than 100 points within the last 24 hours. We can do this a rolling 24 hours. So we can run this
and then throttle it for 24.
Exactly, run it every 30 minutes and throttle it. Now, you'll notice we're throttling based on tactic count and source count. What that means is if there's a new risk rule that comes in, so something else, some other context comes in, those counts increase, you're going to get another notable event for that user because something
Right.
additional has happened.
But it doesn't throttle the accumulation of risk. It only throttles the notable. So eventually, if it's risky, it's a genuine attack, it's going to show up somewhere, sometime, which is good.
Exactly. Yep. Yep.
Now, you also mentioned that you guys are editing the data model distributed with Splunk apps, which some people may not realize. I'm sure you guys do. Data model definitions are monolithic JSON files. They're not stacked settings files like normal things are. How are you working really closely with the ES dev team or that wherever your data model lives, the CIM dev team or wherever it lives, to make sure that your changes get rolled in? Or are you just saying, hey, we're going our own way and YOLO?
Yeah, great question.
Is.
Great question. Yeah, it is this huge thing. As part of this, it's actually a manual step because of that exact thing. I'm not going to go override what you have out of the box without you knowing that it's going to happen. So it's
Because you're creating a potentially gigantic problem for future you, definitely future the guys that come in after you to have to deal with, and you guys have to have some kind of strategy, right?
Yeah, so you know, this kind of started out again over the last couple of years as kind of an idea, and it's now hit the upper echelons of Splunk. So I'm really happy to say that I think most of these fields have been normalized, and as of ES6.4 are actually in the risk data model. I think the notable exceptions to that are the test mode and the threat object stuff. So hopefully those get added in the future. But yes.
So the answer is you're working directly with them, or they're watching you and just following your lead, something like that, right?
Yeah, Jim is really in cahoots with the ES guys. I'll let him talk to you more.
Yeah, I
about
think
that.
you're absolutely right. I mean, there was a transition period, and that's life, right? I think we, the community, partners, were ahead of the game in terms of ES. So
Oh, for sure.
yeah, we made that modification just because the product had to catch up with us. And now, man, if you look at ES6.4, that the number of fields within the schema behind the data model is dramatically increased, and threat objects and the back end, all that stuff is actually there and in product. It's just the front end. You just get caught up with it. The only thing that's maybe missing is test mode. That's it. So I'm really comfortable that for the next 2-3 years, that schema is pretty rock solid. So
I have a couple of clients I've been holding back from making this plunge, holding back both on ES upgrades and on the switch to RBA. So maybe 2 years back, right, from the latest version of ES because of all of the assets and identity shenanigans that have been happening that are necessary, but they frighten me, to be perfectly honest, for some of these clients who are not on the latest and greatest. So I'm wondering, should my approach be, let's stick with our conventional stuff, get you on the latest ES first? Or should we just say, let's just throw everything away. Let's just reinstall and rebuild your stuff.
So we're actually going through that now, and I'm sure other partners are as well. We've got.
How do I advise my clients? What approach should we take?
So it depends on the client, but for now we've got really, 3 approaches, I guess. At least when I say we, it's the Splunk PS organization that's building this, and Tony provides a lot of help, into that directly as well. But you've got the whole what we call RBA. It's kind of tip of the spear. That was the alert fatigue thing. That's everything prior to 6.4, and our advice for new installs. Many customers are a year or 2 out from being able to do ES 6.4. So our advice on that one is start with the new schema on the new data model. Start with that, so that as you upgrade ES, the bulk of your pain regarding an upgrade is really, really almost squarely focused just on that data model schema. So if you set off in that direction on that right foot, that you're good to go. And then we also have PS docs that are built in terms of migrating pre 6.4 to 6.4 and later. So then that's a separate set of documentation, and then you've got everything from 6.4 on forward. The term RBA is dead, so now it's just ES. And if somebody really wants to kind of leverage these techniques
Really? So you're saying that ES from 6.4 and forward is an RBA dedicated product? That's the way
Yep.
it should
Yeah.
be viewed? And
Yeah, and it's called the process is called enterprise security with attribution, because it's so much bigger than just like detection and investigation. And Tony got to see this firsthand, but because we have that giant layer of attributions out there, it fundamentally changes, and we're seeing this every day, almost every day at least. We're seeing that it fundamentally changes not just detection and investigation, but incident response, and it allows people to kind of recalibrate their resources into higher value.
no, you don't have to sell me. I would like everybody I work with to end up here. The
Yeah.
question is, how do I get them from where they are? And a lot of people have been holding back because of all of the changes.
Yeah.
And now they're like, okay, now I can say, you know what? We've got something we can use, which I'm convinced, but I'm just not sure how to make that jump, right? Because there's been a lot of fundamental change in assets and identities and in essentially the risk data model.
Field names remain the same in assets and entities, right? So yeah, the backend's changed, quite a bit, but the field names are the same. So in terms of upgrades, I think that the primary pain point, that I've seen is still really, really, really focused on that schema. So does that make sense that the advice is to
the schema in the risk data model itself, that one data model?
Yep.
Work to get that and work to get that upgraded and cut over, and everything else should be pretty easy.
You bet. Yep.
And you don't think there are going to be significant changes in that data model? It's just going to be adding a few things here or there, not a restructuring.
Yep. I don't see any additions going forward that I need, because for the next 6 months, the really exciting work is really focused on two things. It's building out this threat object concept. That's so much bigger than I think everybody realizes. And then the next phase of activity is really focused on having this layer of attributions that's normalized, right? It's not just here's your 1,000 data sources and the threat hunters have to work on those in a brittle way, and the incident responders have to work on those in a very brittle way, and the adversary simulation people have to work on them, right? All that goes away because now you've got one layer that represents essentially, like, behaviorally your entire ecosystem, and that one layer is that risk analysis data model. So what does that mean when I use words like one layer and schematized? That means that the world of machine learning is now like reality. It's more vendor black box games and nonsense like that. So we're doing a lot of work around auto tuning with machine learning on that layer of abstraction, and auto sanity checking the way that you case or close cases and forecasting.
And this excites you, because this is the part that makes me go, oh, great. So we finally got something great, and now we're going to turn it into a black box where we can't see what's going on.
Yeah, but it's not really a black box.
That disappoints me. That's like, I can see how RBA works. I can see everything. I can see the attack models. Like, I'm excited. I want to get everybody cut over, and then we're going to put this dark magic blanket over the whole thing.
Yeah, not really though, because it's only for things like tuning. Because the biggest pain point, and confirm this with me, Tony, regarding your most recent couple of experiences, would you agree that the biggest kind of mental pain point was the whole tuning process thing with risk rules? Was that one of the big ones?
Yeah, I think we spent a good 3 weeks. We had 100 risk rules. We spent a good 3 weeks dedicated to tuning. And that was basically, we cut, I think we were having 500 notables a day when we initially started, and we got that cut down to 100 notables a day, which was on par with what their SOC was currently handling. And then we had a validation phase where we made sure that every incident that the SOC deemed actionable, that we also caught. So those were kind of our criteria to make sure that we were tuning correctly, so that we were trying to get rid of the stuff we didn't, that they were just closing, didn't want to look at, but yet anything that they found action worthy, we had to make sure that we caught. So that was kind of our tuning lever, because that allowed us to know, okay,
was this ES to ES to pre-RBA ES to post-RBA ES side by side?
So we basically we were running ES notable events, as is, and then we added the 4 risk indicator rules. And yeah, basically we had enterprise security where the analysts were only looking at the notable events initially, and then they had a cutover phase of I think a week or 2 where they were primarily looking at the RBA events, but falling back to their other events, and they would kind of group them together, and we gave them a mechanism to kind of find all of those related events to close them or work on them as one ticket. And then they stopped that and went to you only look at RBA events. And I believe in 1 more month, they shut off all standard notable events. So I'd say most customers that are there today will run like a side-by-side model where, their analysts either start seeing both of them, or at least you have 2 instances of ES up and running. If you want to do it that way, where, one only sees the risk stuff, the other one only sees the native risk correlation searches. And then, you need some sort of a validation phase, because I would say one of the hardest things was actually getting management buy-in after, well, not management buy-in, but management acceptance that this was the way that they wanted to do it. And it wasn't because of, the product or anything like that. It was more that the analysts weren't comfortable with it initially. But the more the analysts used it, the ones that were really hesitant to use it 2 weeks later said, oh my God, this is amazing, because they were able to start seeing stuff that the context that they were never able to see before. And sometimes that crossed domains. So they were very pillared, where you might have an internal threat hunting team and a data exfiltration team, and all of a sudden you're seeing all of that context together. And like, let's just jump over here to look at a notable event. So like when these notable events happen, if we open one of these up, we start seeing these risk messages and all of the rules. Where's the rules? I guess we don't show the rules in this one. But we start seeing all of these risk messages. So when I say tell a story, like your notable event used to be, all right, we have something that ran net.exe. Well, that happens all the time. There's your alert for fatigue, because we don't want to look at those. But that's context now for us. Those are things we want to capture. So we can start looking in here and say, all right, well, they're running who am I? They're running they're definitely doing some discovery. And then we have a new account that was created, and it's changed and enabled. And now we're trying to change a password. Suspicious scheduled tasks. So they're trying to do some sort of persistence. This is telling a story that a single notable event or a single correlation search would never be able to find. So this is that lens that we keep talking about, is when you start looking at this holistically now, it's no longer you're going after a certain thing, one-to-one alerting. You have a picture, and you know what this user or the context around the actions are, to say, all right, well, that really doesn't look right. Does that make sense?
Yep. No. Yeah. So we keep coming back to how great the idea is, and that part's the easy part, right?
Yeah. So I guess to go back to your question,
I think we've crossed over from what we think is great is really weird. Now it's sort of like it's not a niche. Now it's like slightly vogue, like we're hipsters now, and maybe pretty soon we'll be like really cool, like the cool place. But I'm happy with the hipster place, right? Like we get it, and other people get it, and a bunch of people are using it. Like,
yeah.
It's going to be a tsunami soon.
And that's the thing. So to loop back to your initial question, because I think it's an important one. How do you get customers on this? So the current RBA approach is customized per customer. It is not a supported app. You customize it to your needs. And that means that the next guy that comes in has to learn how it was customized. And currently I have not seen 2 customers set up the same way. So that means they could be using different ways of, if we go back to the slide deck real quick, they could be using different ways of creating their risk notables. They might be using different fields. The field names might be different. So right now there isn't 2 customers out there, I would say confidently, that are the same. So from a supportability standpoint, SARBA is very flexible, but not necessarily something supportable. And that was one of my biggest things. I think I've been saying this for a while, is how do we get this thing to be supported? So now that it's in ES, you have a supported method to do this. So all of these screenshots back here, basically what we were doing is trying to use a notable or a risk adaptive response action, but we customized it. ES finally changed how risk adaptive response action worked to take all of these RBA concepts and wrap it into there. So now risk message is part of your adaptive response action. The MITRE tactic and technique is part of your attributions, I think they're called, when you create your correlation search. So, all of those things that were in the risk rule, I won't say all of them, but a majority of those are now offboarded and put into the product. So that means if you do SARBA right now, because you don't want to upgrade, at some point in the future, there will be a supported path being the product, and you'll have to rip out half of the stuff in your correlation searches and put them into the GUI. So I think it's going to be a rather smooth transition. It's not going to be, you can do it slowly because how we do it isn't going to break. But yes, I think the preferred method from a PS standpoint would be upgrade. Now I know, as Jim said, a lot of customers probably aren't going to upgrade in the near future. So that's going to be the challenge.
And in January, I'm not sure if the date's set yet, but in January, we are going to do a 1 hour deep dive into ES64. It's regional. So it's going to be all of the accounts in Texas. All the salespeople are going to drive that. And then anybody that wants to jump into workshops, that kind of stuff, we'll arrange, all that kind of interaction with either Splunk or PS or partners or whatever. So keep your eyes peeled for that.
Yeah, I was going to say that's probably the next piece of this is seeing all the cool new things after it's been out in the field and tested. So
I got a quick question. So as far as an engagement of average time of engagement of how long it takes to apply the RBA and customize that RBA configurations for your customers, do you have any rule of thumbs for those?
Good question. So my last customer, they had started RBA on their own. They were probably about a year into it, but couldn't get it quite over that finish line. So I went in there, and I think in about 2 months, we had them where management was accepting of it and happy. Other PS guys that are out there doing this, I think the standard statement of work is going to be 3 weeks. Basically, in that 3 weeks is a 2-day workshop to really outline what RBA is and kind of figure out how you want to risk score, do all your risk scoring and all of that, coming up with all kind of the logistics, and then a couple days to customize all of the macros, and then really it's just getting your first couple risk rules in. So a typical engagement isn't going to be end-to-end. It is kind of the thought process. It will be teaching the customer to fish. So here's how we create a risk rule. We'll help you create your first 10, 15, 20 risk rules. But at the end of the day, most customers aren't going to want to sit there and pay us to create risk rules all day. So we'll teach them to fish, and then they can continue to expand and adding, more detection methods into SARBA or ES or whatever method they go down the path. But I would say at least 3 weeks. For other customers that want more one-on-one support, longer. But I would say minimum 3 weeks.
So do you do a follow-up efficiency analysis? So after you've taught them to fish and they've been doing it for a year or 6 months, do you then go back and review what they've done?
I would strongly encourage that. If it was, I would say 3 weeks to get it up and going, and then maybe have it so that 2 months later you go in for a week, the same consultant, to do kind of a follow-up. They're going to have pain points. So trying to go in and solve those pain points, now that they were playing with it some more. Now, again, this last customer, their biggest issue was actually just getting the analysts to be accepting of it and adoption of it. So that was really their biggest challenge. So, a lot of what I was doing is that fine grain tuning for them to help them get the, number of notable events down. so that the analysts were happy.
And there's one more point too, Tony, that I'm sure all the PS folks agree on this, but it's that traditional use case based approach to security required kind of a consulting engagement again and again and again, just to make sure that the customer mindset's kind of going to jive with the product mindset, and that's just a tough way to go about it. And I think one of the beauties that we've certainly seen over the last several years is that when you align to something out of the box like MITRE, it's not 100%, but it does kind of change the game in terms of the customer mindset, right? Because, like to Tony's point, once you teach them how to fish, align your data sources to MITRE, then build the damn rules, and then you backfill it with adversary simulation, that customer journey is now like almost self-fulfilling, right? Because then that journey is, if they pick up the phone, they call you and they ask for help, the first question is, well, like, where are you with MITRE? I mean, did you write all the rules based on the data sources that you have available, and have you gone through SSE and taken that big questionnaire to give you all those rules? And if you've completely built those out, the next question is, well, are you testing them on a routine basis? Like, get that done. And then, if that's in place, then it becomes, well, then what's your next data source on board? Is it the monster endpoint, which is, heavy on MITRE, or is it, pre-MITRE, is it extending that capability? But that whole MITRE alignment thing is just so important for folks that are just starting out. And then for the super mature folks, then that's more of a maturity model. And that's something that we don't have yet at Splunk, but Paul, is it Pelletier? Is working on that, where our goal is to partner with partners and everybody else, such that we have a Splunk specific maturity model that starts with everything RBA wise, and everything adversary simulation wise, and threat hunting and threat intel. Like, that whole package then is real formal, and we're all telling that same story, and it maps to sales plays and POCs and product and everything else. So hopefully within the next 3 months before SKO, we'll have that done and we can share that with everybody.
And the other thing to just point out is, once we get away from this, everybody is a special snowflake. It's so customizable. Every client is customizing it to their needs, and it becomes part of the product. And everybody's using that piece of the product. Then we can start reusing stuff. So, then we can go back to, typical ES. You install ES, you turn on 20 out of the box use cases. Well, hopefully we'll have out of the box risk rules that are looking at a lot of things that we can do with data models and that sort of thing. So I think there's a lot that we can still do out of the box, and then really help speed that process up. But again, most of these clients, I would assume, already have ES, or already using ES. So there's going to be some sort of analysis on how do we transition what you currently have to risk rules, whether it's whatever's customized out of the box, or manual. We'll take your correlation search, we'll generalize it, and make it into a risk rule.
Cool stuff.
So hopefully we're gonna get quicker, but I would say still the 3-week time frame. Real quick, I know we're over time, but just to kind of deep dive into a little bit more of this. So, from your incident review panel, you can then create your dashboards and dig down into looking at what these users or systems are doing. Again, this is just a template to show you, the start of possibility. My last client didn't use very much of this, but they basically did a wildcard search against the risk index. So that made it so that you could actually go in, if you're storing source and dest and all of that, you could actually go in, type in that IP address, and it would show you the related objects to the IP address. Normally one of those is the translated host. So then it gave them a kind of a GUI that they could pivot around and add objects in there and start seeing how all of the stuff related together. So that's what they ended up doing. But yeah, I mean, really with the data, you can do so much now. You can, see all your related notable events. Again, your, tactics, techniques, but we can still dive down, and I already have this open because I know it takes a while, but we can still click, and give you ES-like functionality, because again, over here, you don't have a view contributing events is going to show you index equals risk. It's not going to give you raw events. But in this dashboard, with a little bit of lookup magic, you can actually make it so it creates your drill down and gets you back to raw data. So we still have that ES-like functionality of we want to go see what the raw data actually looks like. And we're doing this, the goal is to do this all with the from command. This gives us some schema accelerated event search capabilities, which makes it so that we can get raw data quicker. So we're utilizing those data models even more. Now, this is something new that was introduced in 7.2, so it won't work for customers pre 7.2. But this will make it so it's even quicker than a normal pipe data model search.
Tony, do you think this will be useful for the customers to have the events link within that notable event page?
So no, because the events are based on your risk rule, and over here
Okay.
we're basically saying that you have 15 risk rule hits, let's say. So each one of those has underlying raw events that generated that. So that's why instead of having it over here, it's kind of a one step down. So you start looking at the whole picture, and then if you want to dig into a particular piece, you can still have that functionality. Now this is really this was another big thing that I went in to help this client with because they couldn't get these drill downs to work. And that was a huge thing that the analysts wanted. They're used to being able to go back to raw data. We can't change their job that much from what they're used to. So they need some sort of functionality to do this. So we have solved that issue, and it's basically some hidden fields and a lookup that you don't see in this, but as you click it, it's using that hidden field to generate the search. Again, related threat objects, so we can start to see what file hashes are related, and then we can start pivoting based on file hash if you really want to say what other systems have this file hash. Has this affected multiple systems in the enterprise? I believe most of these you can click on and kind of, again, pivot around. So we see the related system. So then we can go dig in and say, all right, well, what's happened on that system? So a lot of this, again, just for demonstration purposes to get customers something to start with. But most of the time it's going to be customized for whatever the client wants. Does that make sense?
Yes, this is really cool.
And then I guess I don't want to go too much more over time, but I want to show a couple of quotes. Stuart's actually here. This is, I think, a really, really good quote. But basically, when he implemented this, they were able to increase detections, reduce alerting, align with MITRE, and achieve a 60% true positive rate. So that's huge. And I would say even my last customer, they would in a couple months they'll probably echo something very similar to this. When I left there, their analysts went from I'm not really sure because change is difficult and you're changing how I work, to this is amazing and I can't believe we didn't have visibility into all of this before. Like, it makes my job easier. So there's a lot of good things coming for this, I think. Other considerations, yeah, you definitely need to normalize those IPs. Throttling, we talked about that. And then I guess the last thing I really wanted to show you, there's a bunch more, but there's a bunch of conference talks. These are all free. If you didn't go to Conf and see them, you can go right online and watch all of these. The slide decks are there. I know Stuart's done them, Jim's done them. I think Haley Mills did one this last year, all about looking at that analyst dashboard and kind of some things to think about as you're building that out. So there's a ton of information out there on how to get started, how to mature, and just different pieces of RBA. So there's tons out there. So if you are interested, the slide decks on RBA all day. There's phantom playbooks already built out there to get you started. RBA, all the source codes out there are available, and then bunch of these links to all those external resources. So it's not just this one deck. There's plenty more decks out there that go into very specific pieces of RBA. I think between them all, there's pretty good coverage of what RBA is capable of doing. So again, I don't want to go over too much, so I will pause there and stop for questions.
Tony, real quick, on that list, there's a talk that Jim and Jimmy Mills gave. I think, and Jim will correct me, I think that was .conf 19. That's another really good one because it actually stepped through kind of the evolution of them onboarding RBA and kind of some of those plateaus or obstacles they came across as they were putting it in. So that's a really good one as well.
Yeah, I think that's us getting started one. But yeah, that one was great.
I think it was, yeah, the 1803. And the cool thing that struck me with Texas Instruments and Jimmy was that when they started, and they were pretty proud of what they did, and just in a nonchalant manner, they kind of said, well, hey, after we did like 10 rules, we realized this whole entire aspect of our business within the SOC was kind of screwed up, and we made improvements over here. And then we added 10 more rules. And then we realized that, man, we had no visibility to this other whole aspect within the SOCs. And then we hit the pause button, and then we worked on this kind of stuff. And then we added 10 more. So it was this journey of like 5 or 6 milestones regarding just visibility within the enterprise. That was a really interesting journey. And that's when I asked them to do that .conf talk with me to talk about those milestones. And that's in that 1803.
And I believe they did the kind of the slow rollover where they were running ES and RBA simultaneously, correct?
They were, I don't think they were one of the customers though that took the time to crank out all kinds of quantitative data like Stuart did and Charles Schwab is doing, and then like Viasat did this year. They gave me a bunch of quantitative stuff to talk about their 3-month journey and their 95% reduction in abandoned cases. I mean, like that kind of stuff is amazing. You only get that from an existing customer that works that transition for and maintains that overlap for like a month or so. But that's always so gratifying to see because that's real and that's real security.
Are you going to be sharing this slide deck? Because those look like really good articles to read.
Yep, zip on out to deck.rbaallday.com. Yep.
Put it in the. I'll put it in the chat as well. But I think Suman has everybody's email and can probably email that out as well.
Yeah,
Perfect.
I have the recording as well for this.
Oops, not desk, deck.
I do have a raffle, that $50 gift card that we initially mentioned. So please hang in there. Tony, you have anything, or anybody else have any questions for Tony?
Oh, good stuff, man. It's always important to hear from somebody that's implementing it, at customer sites, because you've got the actual feedback and kind of the value from kind of a non-vendor perspective. So that's good.
Yeah, and like I said, I'm so far I'm really impressed with what 6.4 is going to bring because a lot of my challenges have been solved. So, and it's repeatable. We no longer have a non-supported thing that's so cool that customers are scared of. So.
Yep.
Well, we're